Okay, in this video we're going to investigate the client side of how you could create a chat program. So again, what I mean by client side is this is just the browser side, the user-facing side. So in a real chat program, the messages would be sent to a server and then sent to all the other users in the chat room. So we're just doing the client side. So really we only have one person chatting, it's just going to be you, but this will give you some insight into how these types of things are made. Okay, so when we get finished, it's going to look something like this. You have a little heading, and then this is the chat view. You have your chat message and send. And I can type a few things. Hello, how are you? And press enter, and then I'm doing fine. All right. And you can either press the send button or press enter, and so we'll get into some of the different events that are involved in here, and also parsing the contents of this text area and appropriately modifying it so we get the functionality we want in the chat view, such as replacing newline characters in the chat. If I hit shift enter, I can create newline characters, but I actually want to replace those with BR tags because this is just an HTML div. And so when you want a new line in HTML, you use a BR tag. So we'll go into some of that stuff in depth, but this again is just the client-side version of this to take a look at how this could be made, and it's used in lots of different sites these days. All right. So I've started up chat.html. This has the basic startup of a page. Most of you should be familiar with this. HTML head, don't forget your doc type. Title, I just called it chat, and then we have style, and these are some of the basic styles. So most people like to use box sizing these days. Okay, so this is on all elements. We're going to apply box sizing border box. It's going to make some of our calculations easier. These are the basic properties we put on almost all of our HTML pages. No margin, position absolute, top 0, left 0, width 100%, height 100%, and then some sort of background color. This is just the basic setup. We've done this lots of times. And then we're going to have a simple page heading, which is an H1 tag. So this H1 tag here has an ID that's called page heading, and we reference that ID in CSS with the pound symbol and then the ID name. This is the CSS selector, and it applies these CSS values, these properties, to this element. All right. And so that's the style, and that's the end of our head tag, and in the body, as you can see, we just have this one heading, right? And then at the very end of the body tag, the last child of body should be your script tag, all right? And all we have here is a little bit of JavaScript. It says running application. Okay, so I can show you this file. You know, we can open it up in open up the developer tools, right? You can get to those by settings. Let's see, more tools, and it's up here. There we go, more tools and developer tools. But I use the shortcut Control-Shift-I. All right, so we see that the JavaScript is working. We see that our styles are working. We've got the background color change and the color of our heading. So now we want to get to it. We want to start building this thing out. All right, so we have to think through kind of the divisions of our page, the sections of our page that we're going to need. Right, so if we look back at the completed example, we have kind of a viewing area. This is the chat view, right? And then we have a chat controls area. So there might be a lot of other controls in here eventually, like different things you can press that will do different things in the chat. Okay, so we need two main sections there. So what we can do is just add those divs. And the first one we will call chat view. And then the next div, we're going to have a class on there and call it chat controls, excuse me. Okay, so these are our two main divs, and we're going to need to add some CSS properties to these. Okay, so back up here to CSS, we've got .chat view. So anything with the class name, that's what the dot means, it looks for the class name, any elements with chat view, these CSS styles are going to be applied. And then we're going to make one for chat controls as well. Alright, so let's just start, and we want to make the width relative to some percentage of the body, right? So we could just use the width property and use percentages, 80%. And then we might want to make a default height of 400 px. And we kind of want this thing centered on the screen, so we're going to put the margin left and the margin right to auto. Or we can just say margin 0, and then that's top and bottom, and then left and right is auto. Or we could manually say margin left, auto, and then margin right, auto. Okay, that gives us some centering, and we want to look at this thing. We need to be able to tell that the height and width are set up correctly. So one of the things you can do commonly is set a background color. So you can tell the difference between our page background color here, which is this kind of dark gray, and we're gonna match the page heading for the background color on this. So. And let's see, then we have chat controls, and it's going to be largely the same things. We're going to want the width to be 80%. We might want the height to be a lot smaller. Let's say the height is 100 px. Right. Margin left, margin right, we'll do the same thing there, but this time we'll use the other method. So if you only specify two properties of margin, the first one is the height and width, or I'm sorry, the top and bottom, and then the second property is the left and right. So left and right are the ones that we want to specify as auto. Alright, so we'll do that and specify our background color again, and we can just copy and paste that here. And that's good enough for now. So at this point, all we've done is added two divs and some basic styles. Okay, height, width, super common, add a little margin and background color. Nothing complicated yet. Alright, and so we see it as we change the page size, that 80%, the width of our chat, that's working appropriately, but we only kind of see one big blob here, right? And that is fine, because actually it's just because we don't have any borders. We can't tell when the chat view ends and the chat controls begin, right? So somewhere around here is actually another element. If I right click and inspect, we can see we're on chat controls, and now we can see the differences. Up here I'm on chat view, and down here, right? But without that border, the user of the page, they don't usually get into the developer tools. They're not going to know where the chat view starts and where the chat controls begin. So we're going to have to add some border, which is no problem. We'll say border. That's going to be 1px, solid black. And we'll do the same thing down here. There we go. Now, because both of these borders, right here in the middle where they meet, there's a top border here on the bottom element, right, the chat controls element. There's a border there of 1 pixel, and then on the bottom side of the chat view, there's a 1 pixel border as well. So this line appears to be fatter than the others, which is not terrible, but it's not quite what people would expect. So we're going to add a little tweak here, and in the chat controls we're going to say border top none. Okay, and what that's going to do is that's going to take off in this bottom section, the chat controls, the top border, it's going to set that to none. So we refresh the page, and now we see that it's very subtle, but that can make those subtleties can make the difference in how your page looks and feels, and makes it look and feel more professional, giving people the confidence to use your site. Alright, so that's a subtle little thing. Also, this is a little bit jagged. Let's round out some of these corners a little bit. Now we have two div elements here. We have a top div element, and we just want to round out the top corners like that, but leave these square because they're going to match up with our chat controls. Similarly, on the chat controls element, the top ones we need to leave square, but the bottom ones will round a little bit. Okay. So to do that, we're going to use the border radius property. Let's go to chat view, border radius. All right, and border radius starts at the top left corner. All right, so if I want, I could say 20 pixels, and then that goes clockwise after that. So it's the top left corner and clockwise. So we want the two top corners. So 20px, 20px, and then 0, and then 0. All right, and then we can copy and paste this down here. But we want the top two for the chat controls to be 0 and 0, and then the last two corners to be rounded. Okay, so if we go back to the page and take a look at this, we see that we have rounded these corners, and essentially what the 20 pixels is, we go 20 pixels from the corner where the edges of the circle would flushly meet the sides. That radius is 20 pixels. Okay, so that's what border radius is. And you see we've done it on the left, the top left, top right, and then bottom left and bottom right. Okay, so this is kind of looking a little bit better than just blocky and square. All right, and so we want to do subtle things that make the user feel more comfortable and more confident in our site. All right, so what's next? Well, inside this chat view, we're going to have some padding probably, because we're going to be adding text to it. Right? So what we can do to test that out is we can just have some text. Hi, how are you? And then add a BR tag, and I'm fine, thanks. And then add a BR tag. Okay, so this is, we're simulating what we're eventually going to have here. When we're all finished, we're not going to have this text in here to start out, but we're just simulating that for now because we need to set up our padding and make sure everything looks good in here. So we reload the page and we see right away this does not look good. Right? So what we want to do is in this div, we're going to add some padding on the top and on the left and on all the sides to make this more appropriate. Right? Look at the view there. So what we want to do here is in the chat view, we'll set a padding. And then that padding starts at the top and then goes clockwise. So for the padding at the top, we might have 20px, and then the left and right sides will be 50. So 50px, 20px, 50px. Okay. And then similarly for our controls, we're going to want some sort of padding, but probably not the same amount of padding. We'll check on that in a second. But let's just see what we got here. Now that looks a little bit better. That looks more like a chat program, and you can see as we add things down here, the chat is going to fill up. All right, so one thing we also need to consider, I'm going to copy and paste this a whole bunch of times. Oops. Copy and paste. Didn't quite get the indentation right when I copy and paste. So we'll do that. And what we're going to try to simulate is a really long text conversation, chat conversation, and we need to make sure that the view scrolls. Now again, none of this stuff is going to be in here in the actual program. We're just putting in this is like, you might call this dummy data or test data. We're putting this in here to test out how our view behaves when there's lots of data. All right, so we go back in here and reload the page. Now this is common in CSS, right? So the bounds of the box we are using, the div, is here, but the content overflows the box. And as you might guess, this is called overflow. So what we want to do to make this more appropriate is in our chat view, we're going to say overflow auto. And that basically says automatically create a scroll bar if there's too much content for the size of the div or the size of the element. So we can reload the page, and now we see this is much more appropriate for a chat. Right? Now we do kind of lose the niceness of our corner here, but we need that functionally. And there are things you can do to adjust that, but that's a bit more in depth. Okay, but you still do see kind of behind that is still rounded. It's just this scroll bar was slapped in there over the top, and it kind of looks pointy on this corner now. But it's a relatively small thing, and that actually is fixable, but that's a little bit more complicated. All right, so it looks like this is pretty good for kind of a chat window, right? So let's take a look at the controls. We can go ahead and clear out all of this dummy text. All right. And in the chat controls, what we're going to want is a text area. And we're going to want a button. So type button, we're going to have an on click. And this on click is going to be send message. Now we have not made this. This is going to be a JavaScript function that executes when we click this button. We've not yet made this, so we have to remember to make that. We can put a little note in our JavaScript. We can go ahead and make it real quick. This is the send message. And then we can log to the console just to test send button pressed. Okay, so this is the function that's going to be called. We're going to change the body here, right? But we're making this button. It's a type button. It's not a submit button. And we have an on-click attribute. And we're setting that equal to the JavaScript that we want to execute when this button is clicked. Okay, on the click event. All right, so that's the button tag opening, and then we want the content of this button to say send, and then /button. Okay, so this is basically the only content that we're going to have in here. So let's take a look, and we want it to look good. But again, we have that same sort of problem. We need to kind of add the padding and make this look a little bit nicer. All right, so we might need to add some CSS to this thing as well. So let's add an ID, which we're going to need the ID to grab this element at some point. So we need the ID for a couple of reasons. Message box, right? And then we can have a button here that says ID equals, and this is the send button. Okay, so remember, IDs must be unique to the elements in your page. The expectation is no two elements have the same ID property. So you should be very careful about how often you use IDs. In general, if you can avoid it, don't use them at all. Most of the time in professional development, you just use class names. But this is a small demo, so this is fine. All right, so we've got our IDs, and we want to set some style properties. We might need to set that up. So the CSS selector for an ID is the pound symbol, and then I have a message box. Right, and then the CSS selector for the send button. All right, and that's pretty good. And one of the things we want to do here, first in the chat controls area, we're going to want to add padding like we did for the chat view. So padding can take one property or one value and apply it to all four sides. It can take two values, and if you do two values, the first one is the top and bottom padding, and the second value is the left and right. So we're going to use that one. We just want 10 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, and then maybe 20 pixels of padding on the left and right. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's reload and see what that did. Okay, that looks better right there. But we still need to expand this out and kind of center all of this. We probably want the send button, instead of being, offset here, vertically aligned in a strange way, we probably want the send button on top, because we also have to think these text areas are adjustable. So if they adjust it to be larger, we don't probably want the send button at the bottom or the middle. We probably want it on top. Right? So you have to think about all the different ways this can be done. But when we're finished, we probably want something that looks about like this, with the send button on top, and they can make it a little bit bigger if they want to. All right, so let's add some CSS to do that. We will say width is 85%. And so that's going to make, this is our message box, right? So that's going to be the text area. And we want to vertically align to the top. All right, and then the send button, all we really need there is to vertical align to the top. Okay, so we can reload this page, and there we go. We've got a nice fluid view. We can make it bigger and smaller, and if it shrinks down, that goes underneath. Right, so this is nice. It kind of grows and shrinks. So it's kind of a fluid or dynamic layout. All right, so what's next? Well, what's next is this is most of the layout, right? So all we need to do now is really do the JavaScript. This is kind of the interesting part, where we grab different elements. As I type something in here and press send, right? Go to the console, we see that the send button is working, right? If I press send, what I want to do is grab this element, this is the text area, and get the contents of this control, right? And we use that with the dot value property on the element. This is going to grab the contents here. Then what I want to do is I want to grab the view, take whatever was already in the view, and then add to it this. Okay? So let's just start there. All right, so this is the send message. So what we want to do is we're going to have to, at some point, get both of these two elements. This is the chat view. That's where we're going to need to place the text. And then this is the message box. We're going to need to get that eventually as well. So let's just get both of them. We can get rid of that console.log. We don't need that anymore. We need declare a constant, because this value won't change. But you could use let here if you wanted to. Constant is more advanced. If you know your variable isn't going to change, you use const. Chat view element. All right, and this is going to be that element. So how do we retrieve elements? We know we do document .get elements. Now this one is plural because I'm doing class name. So get elements by class name. Okay. Now the plural is important because it's going to grab all of the elements. And if you have multiple elements, that means you're probably going to return an array. Right? So the assumption is that this is going to return an array. So first, what's the class name we're looking for? Well, we're trying to grab the chat view. So if we look up here, chat view is the class name we're grabbing, and that's where all of our messages are going to go. So we're going to grab the chat view element. All right, now again, elements by class name, that's an array. Since we only have one div or one element with the class chat view, and we know one exists, we can just go ahead and access the first element in that array like this. Okay. Alternatively, we could add an ID here and then do document.get element by ID, but you need to be aware of how to do both. All right, so that's the chat view element, and then we need to get the message box element. Okay, message box element, and this one, the message box does have an ID. It's the send button, so we can use document.get element by ID. And the ID here is the send button. Okay, so now we've got these two elements, and the basic concept that we want to do first, right? We don't want to do too much without testing. So all we've done is we've gotten two elements. We could log these to the console, but we're pretty confident that this is grabbing the elements correctly. And And let's just do one more thing, to make sure this is working. Okay, so we got a couple more lines of code. So we want to take the data from the message box, right? So this is our message, or we can call it new message, right? And this is going to be a variable. We'll use let for this because this will probably change. So new message, we get this from the message box element here, right? That's the text area. So to access, it's a control, right? Any of the controls to access the value associated with that control, you say dot value in JavaScript. Okay, so that new message is going to be the value of what's stored in the text box. Then what I can do is I can say chat view element. What I want to do is access the inner HTML. Now this gets people a whole lot. That HTML must be capitalized because this is part of the JavaScript API in the browser. Okay, a lot of times you will see people make variables like this, my HTML. Okay, that's just a variable name, and this is really common. You'll see it like this, and more in camel case style. All right, but this is part of the JavaScript API, and you must use all capital letters. All right, that's very important. All right, so we're going to avoid that problem. We're not going to use any variables that have HTML in it. But just know that you can see that. So in the JavaScript API, to actually access the inner HTML of an element, it must be all capitalized or it will not work. Okay, so we're going to set the inner HTML to this new message. Now this isn't the final behavior we want, but we want to do as little as possible before we test. So we've only added 4 lines of code, and we're pretty confident that these 4 lines of code should work. So let's test it. This is going to grab both of the elements, the view and the text area, and then it's going to grab the message from the text area and put the message into the view. And that's all it's going to do. All right, so let's say hello, and then send. Okay, so we do have an issue. Let's console.log. Send. We're pretty sure that was working. And let's console.log our chat view element. And console.log our message box. So when something's not working, console.log is your friend. Console.log new message, right? And then let's refresh and see what we have. Okay, so the function is being called. So we see the send button is being pressed. We are accessing the chat view. We are accessing the button. There's my problem. I grabbed the send button. What I really wanted to grab was the text area. Okay, so that's where console.log can come in and let you know. I logged out my element and I see that I have grabbed the wrong element, right? So that's important. So this is I have it labeled as the message box element, but for some reason I spaced it and did the send button. Okay, so what we want is the text area message box, right? So let's change that, message box. Alright, and we refresh the page. Now again, that's a great example of why you only want to do a few things at once before you test it. Alright, so now we see this is kind of working. I can say hello and press send. Alright, but what this should probably do is we want to keep what's here and add to it. Right? Instead, right now we're just replacing. Okay, so we can get rid of these console.logs, clean it up a little bit. Okay, so what we need here probably is let existing. So this is, you can call this the existing chats, or we can just call this chats. These are the existing chats in the chat view. So I'm going to make a variable called chats and say chat view element dot inner HTML. Remember, all capitals there. All right, so this is going to take whatever is in the chat view and store it in this variable as a string. Then what we can do is we can say chats equals whatever it did before plus our new message. Okay, in this way we get all of the chats that were already there, and then we add our new message, and then here we set the chat view to this new variable that contains our new message as well. Alright.